Welcome to Exploring with Scientists. My name is Alice, and I'm a graduate student at Michigan State University. In this video of Exploring with Scientists, we're going to talk about how scientists come up with their questions. Let's get started. Before we talk about how scientists develop their questions, I want to know, if you were a scientist, what would you study and why? Say it out loud. Maybe if you were a scientist, you would study space and the stars and the galaxies. Maybe if you were a scientist, you want to ask questions about rocks and be a geologist. Or maybe, like me, you're interested in moths and butterflies. So let's figure out how scientists come up with their questions and answer them. Like I said, all science starts with questions. Questions help scientists guide what they're going to try to figure out. There are two important variables that make a question appropriate for answering with science. The question has to be mysterious, and the question has to be answerable. So mysterious means that no other scientist or person has ever answered your question. This makes a question good for answering with science. The other key important variable is that your question needs to actually be answerable. There are some questions in life that just aren't answerable, like it'd be very hard to know what happens once we die, or uh, other questions like that. But some questions you can actually answer. An example of a question that's both mysterious and answerable is, what makes my cat Bijou purr? This is my cat Bijou. Let's say, for example, that I don't know what makes her purr. I actually do, but let's just say, for hypothetical reasons, that I don't know what makes Bijou purr. So this is a mystery. I can actually answer this question by doing an experiment, so this question is answerable. I would answer this question by giving Bijou different things to see if they make her purr. I might give her pets, or I might give her treats, and see which of those things make Bijou purr. So, questions that are appropriate for science are both mysterious and answerable. But where do questions come from? Well, questions can come from observation or inspiration. Observation is when you see something and notice it, and inspiration is something that you think is really cool. An example of an observation that I had that I was inspired by is seeing moths visiting flower. I wondered, are they pollinators like bees? And I had seen bees have pollen all over their bodies, and I was inspired by this. And I wondered, do moths also carry pollen all over their bodies, or do they carry pollen in only a few places on their bodies? So I observed something and I was inspired. Another place that questions come from is called gaps in the literature. So when scientists are done with a science project, or they're done answering their question, they typically write a paper about it and publish it in a journal, which is kind of like a magazine. A gap in the literature means that no other scientist has written about your question or topic before. And so sometimes people come up with questions because they notice that no one else has answered this question before. So usually once you come up with questions, you have to come up with hypotheses. A hypothesis is a prediction about the future. And hypotheses are important because usually after you're done answering your question, you have to determine if your hypothesis was correct or if something different happened. My question is, where do moths carry pollen on their bodies? And my hypothesis, or my prediction, is that the location of pollen will depend on how a moth visits a flower. So like I said, my hypothesis is that the location of pollen will depend on how a moth visits a flower. And there are two main ways that moths visit flower. They might hover, like this moth on the top, which means that they keep flying and don't actually land on the flower. And I'm predicting or I'm hypothesizing that hovering moths will accumulate pollen on their faces and their proboscis, which are their tongues. This is a moth's proboscis. Then, so there are moths that hover, and there are also moths that land or they rest on a flower when they visit, like this moth on the bottom. And I'm predicting that moths that land on flowers will get pollen on more places of their body. They'll get it on their face, on their proboscis or their tongues, and also on their legs, which are touching the flower. So, once you have your question, you need to figure out what's the best way to answer my question. And there are two main ways that scientists answer questions. They answer questions through experiments and observations. An experiment is when you change something about the environment and then make observations. The observations or an observational study is when you observe something as it is naturally without changing anything. So remember, in experiments, you change something and then observe, and in observational studies, you observe without changing. So for my question, which is where do moths carry pollen on their bodies, I haven't answered it yet, and I have to figure out how to answer it. I've decided to do both observation and experiment to answer my question. So, to answer my question through observation, I'm going to collect moths in the wild so I won't be changing anything about their environment. I'll then swab different parts of their body with little tiny cubes of jelly. I'll swab their legs, I'll swab their faces, I'll swab their tongue proboscis, and then I can put this little cube of jelly on a microscope slide and look at the pollen under a microscope. So it's really magnified. And I can count how many types of pollen and how many individual grains of pollen are on the moth's bodies. So that's how I'll answer the question through observation. I'll be able to see through my microscope slides if moths are carrying pollen on their legs or their faces or other body parts. I'm also going to answer my question through experimentation. So remember, an experiment is when you change something about the environment and then observe. So in this case, I'll be taking a hovering moth, which means a moth that doesn't land on the flower, and then also a landing moth, which does land on the flower. And they'll take turns being in an enclosure with a flower. So I'm changing something about their environment. I'm actually putting them with a flower. Then I'll take the moths out and again swab different parts of their body with jelly cubes and put those cubes of jelly on the flower. After I've done that, I'll be able to see which parts of the moth's body had pollen on them and how much pollen. So that's how I'm going to answer this question. Where do moths carry pollen on their bodies? Through both observation and experiment. But before I can do those observational studies and my experiments, I need to get ready to go out into the field. For the observational study, I need to get all my supplies for collecting moths ready. That means I need to get a light bulb because moths are attracted to light, and that's how I bring them to me. I'll also need to get a field guide, which is how I can identify which kinds of moths I'm seeing. For my experiment, I'll need to get flowers and moths, and I'll start with caterpillars, not adult moths, so I can do my experiments with the moths and flowers in enclosures. So I'm asking, where do moths carry pollen on their bodies? I want to know, what scientific questions do you want to ask next? Maybe you are inspired by my inspiration and also want to ask questions about moths and butterflies. or maybe you want to ask about some other scientific topic. That's all for this video of Exploring with Scientists. Thanks for watching. Bye!